Monomachine makes lots of awesome synth sounds, both classic and futuristic, and that's the main reason I got one. But one of the first things I wanted to know was if I could get a satisfying kick drum out of it. Not because I needed to, I just wanted to. The most straightforward way to get a kick out of the Monomachine is to use the built-in beatbox machine, which is essentially all of the 12-bit drum samples from the Machinedrum's E12 kit, all smashed into one sound-generating engine. During my initial experiments learning the basics of the Monomachine, I never quite got a kick that I found truly satisfying using the beatbox machine, despite the huge variety it offers combined with the Monomachine voice architecture. Fortunately, just like the Machinedrum, the Monomachine comes with a sine wave generator. So let's see what's possible just working with the basics. I'm setting this first LFO up as a pitch envelope to sweep the sine wave. One nicety of the Monomachine is the very fine control you have over pitch modulation depth, but this feature isn't that important in this percussive context. Now it's time to adjust the amplitude envelope. When you're working with the sequencer inside the Monomachine, you can basically just ignore the release value. Very fine adjustments of the hold parameter can dramatically change the punch and attack of your percussive sounds. The distortion parameter is a deceptively powerful feature on the Monomachine. That's because it's not precisely a distortion, but rather a headroom control. Going into negative values will increase the headroom, and it's an excellent parameter to modulate. Let's try putting an envelope on the distortion. So the distortion parameters in the amp page, conveniently that's the default LFO target on the amplitude page. Get that exponential shape. Need to adjust the distortion value now. When increasing the headroom by turning the distortion value negative, you'll often want to increase the gain after the filter by using the volume parameter. However, be aware that this will raise the noise floor. So now that I have this layer of the kick drum, it's time to go into the filter and beef things up. Note at this point that the key tracking on the filter is turned on by default for the Monomachine. I want to change up the texture of the sound, so I'm going to turn up the low-pass resonance. Now to engage the filter envelope modulation on the low pass. Okay, let's see if I can get this to become an actual bass drum at some point. This is getting rather tubby and surprisingly wooden sounding. Counting the amplitude envelope, we're now using 4 total envelopes to control the shape of this sound. You can spend a lot of time just exploring the different relationships between the modulations. Getting a very deep kick, but here's where the Monomachine filter stops sounding quite as wooden and starts to sound more plastic to me. For more adventurous bass drum sounds, as well as tom sounds, engaging the high-pass filter and its resonance can be very useful. With the original sine wave along with the dual resonant filter peaks, we actually have 3 oscillators here. I'll stick to the basics though. Time to revisit the headroom. Properly dialing in the relationship between the distortion and volume parameter is something I focus a lot on with the Monomachine. Once I get a decent percussive sound going, I'm going to very carefully tweak the hold and decay to see how they interact with the pitch envelope timings that I'm using. Now to adjust the headroom for this punchier, more sustained bass drum. Let's try this with a bit more saturation. I liked it about here for now. Take a look at the filter again. Let's take a gander at the EQ and see what that can do for us. It's important to realize that the EQ will interact with the headroom of the Monomachine. I'll try adjusting the headroom now. I'm not sure quite what I expected, but it wasn't this. At this point, you can hear the noise floor of the Monomachine has been raised substantially. About time to revisit the LFO envelopes. I don't want it so farty right now. Okay, that's a bit better. Now I want to go back to that EQ. Since the Monomachine has an independent delay on each channel, it's very hard not to abuse this aspect. The built-in variable width bandpass filter on the delay makes it very, very flexible. Here I'm just creating delay repeats of the high-frequency portion of the bass drum sound. Negative delay send values preserve the stereo image, while positive delay send values create a ping-pong delay. Feeling the need to change up the triggers a bit, I'll just add one here for now. I'm wanting more movement in this sound overall. I think I'm going to add some modulation to the amplitude envelope decay. Getting a little more movement. Time to change up the trigger pattern. I want to hear my modulations better. Okay, it took a while, but it's time for a new sound. I'm going to add a noise generator onto this track. Okay, time for trigs. Okay, let's get that envelope adjusted. A really cool feature of the Monomachine noise generator is the ability to control the stereo width. I think I'll try modulating that and see how it works out. So synth page and then ST. I'll set this to hold behavior. That's pretty cool, expanding and contracting noise sound. You can also crossfade the noise generator to red noise. Time for some of that amplitude envelope decay modulation. Very cool expansion and contraction of stereo field, as well as the amplitude envelope. Time to get the delay in on this action. I'll go with a positive delay send value to enhance the activity in the stereo image even further. Time for some EQ on this one. Let's put some modulation on that EQ frequency. Ooh, that's nice, playing excellently with the delay send. Tweak that EQ a bit. Now it's time for another machine. I'm going to put a reverb on this track. Internally, the Monomachine has 3 stereo routing buses. I'll set up this reverb machine to get its input from bus CD. And now I need to go back to those other tracks and make them output on bus CD as well as bus AB. That way I get a parallel send into my reverb. Need to trig this reverb machine. And now to turn up the hold. But just leaving it all the way up like this is kind of boring and not really using it to full potential. But let's fiddle with the parameters a bit. Although obviously very similar to the Machinedrum Master reverb, I find the Monomachine reverb to be a bit more hi-fi. It's also very sensitive to input gain. Possibly the biggest advantage the Machinedrum reverb has over the Monomachine is the fact that it has a pre-delay. Okay, now I'm thinking it's time to put the Monomachine voice architecture to work on this reverb channel. I'm going to put some more trigs down. Now to adjust the amplitude envelope. Need to go back and adjust the noise generator sound a bit. Now I'll shape it more with the filter resonance, and filter envelopes. Okay, back to the reverb to do the same thing. Let's make these airy chunks fly around even more by putting some ping pong delay on it. Time to engage that EQ. I never turned filter tracking off for any of my sounds, so I'm a little curious what repitching these bass drum sounds will do. This is pretty cheesy, but whatever. Maybe I'll try to polish this turd. pretty ridiculously messy, but that's the Monomachine sometimes. It's hard to resist those delays. I'll reduce the feedback a bit on some of these. I'm going to sweep around the EQ on the reverb now. And I'll filter those delay repeats. Thinking it's time for some P-locks on the bass drum trigs. I'll start lengthening the decay on some of the hits. And now to tweak the headroom slightly. Okay, now that we have a big mess, might as well make it messier. I'm going to add a flanger on this track. I'll set the CD bus to be the input, just like the reverb channel. Since the Monomachine flanger offers very high feedback amounts, it can generate sustained tones. This makes it very effective as a synthesis tool, although you're going to have to spend quite some time in order to figure out its quirks and dial it in. I'll disable that internal LFO. And I'll crank the steps up. The delay time controls your pitch. Okay, need some more triggers now. Now I'll find a default pitch I want to work from. That's fine for now. Time to adjust the amplitude envelope. As always, careful adjustment of the headroom is important, especially with how the flanger can sometimes unexpectedly generate very high signal levels. Okay, that took too long. Time for the delay. Okay, filter those repeats. Change the delay time. Now to hit up the EQ real fast. Now to adjust the headroom. The main difference between the volume parameter and the track level parameter is the volume parameter can be P-locked and modulated by the LFOs. Change up these flanger triggers some more. Now I'm thinking that I want to try some modulation in the flanger delay time. Time to make this even goofier with a random LFO. I'll turn up the random LFO speed so that there's a new value for every trigger. Make the modulation a bit deeper. It's interesting how much slew we get on the pitch changes of the flanger. I think I'll clean up this delay send a little. Let's emphasize some lower frequencies with the EQ. And now adjust the center of the delay time. Probably time to mess with the depth and speed controls now. Negative feedback on the flanger will produce odd harmonics instead of even harmonics, and those odd harmonics are shifted down an octave. I set the feedback value to 0 because now I'm going to put some modulation on it to shift the flanger between negative and positive feedback values over time. I'll start with a square wave LFO set to full depth. In this scenario, some trigs will get maximum negative feedback, while other trigs will get maximum positive feedback. the LFOs on Elektron machines, you can clip the waveforms. An LFO depth of 64 is all that's necessary to modulate a parameter from 0 to 127, assuming it's at a central value, like 63 or 0 for a parameter that can go negative. Time to activate the filter on this flanger channel. Getting a bit irritated at that reverb. Need to adjust it. Since this reverb is now heavily filtered and enveloped, adjusting the reverb parameters is a little bit tricky. Turning the mix up a bit. With higher mix and input values, the reverb will tend to overload and saturate quite quickly. I'll turn the mix back down, not feeling the saturation on the reverb. Now to mess with the filter. Okay, time to mute some things. So this is what we ended up with without any of the parallel processing channels. Okay, engage the flanger channel. Okay, I'll mute the flanger and enable the reverb. Okay, I want to tweak that filter. Now for a look at the track effects. This reverb channel has had a pretty short envelope for some time. I just had a fun idea. I want to put some modulation panning on these reverb hits, as if there wasn't enough stereo activity already. I should tame the delay send at least a little bit. Let's see what the EQ can bring into focus. Let's mess with that sine wave sound. I want to hear how it interacts with the reverb. I should probably turn the delay send to negative to get rid of this ping-pong stereo delay in the low frequencies. But how about I make it worse by changing the filtering of the repeats? Curious what this sounds like without this big wash of effects. Okay, I think it's time to revisit these basic sounds a little bit. Time to adjust this envelope on the sine wave. Okay, time to mess with the P-locks on these triggers. Mainly want a big fat hit right at the beginning of the pattern. Try adjusting the headroom. Now to adjust the LFO envelopes. take a look at the noise channel modulation. I'll turn this modulation up for the stereo width of the noise. And now I'll increase the depth of the decay modulation. Now to tweak the EQ modulation. I'm going to unmute the reverb now. Let's try high passing that a good bit. And I haven't used this filter envelope either. Okay, I'll bring the flanger back now. Try getting more aggressive with this filter. Now I don't feel like random delay time modulation anymore for the flanger. A simple square wave is a good way to modulate between two relevant values. Now to adjust the default delay time. This is very heavily filtered, so I need to go adjust that. Maybe some high pass filter resonance. Okay, back to the sine wave. Now to listen without the processing. I like how the Monomachine mutes triggers instead of the audio channel.